the red flag flying here.
Hello and welcome to Socialist Think Tank. Today we are here with Kristin Linderoth. Hello, Kristin.
Hi, Paul.
How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm absolutely brilliant at the moment. Thank you very much. So I'm going to just start off in a slightly different way this time and just ask you to give a little background about who you are and maybe a little bit about why I've asked you to come on today.
Okay. Well, I live in the south of Sweden, and I've been an active member of the Swedish labor movement for 25 years or so. And I am also a researcher, and I just finished my doctoral thesis, which is on a big strike that took place in Sweden in 2003. And what else? I'm a freelance writer as well. So I do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And the reason I'm here, I think, is because in 2017, together with my partner, Philip, I traveled to Durham for the Durham Miners Gala. And then we returned in 2018, and then we returned again in 2019, and we were going to return in 2020, but because of the pandemic, of course, the gala was cancelled and we couldn't have traveled anyway. This has sort of the Durham Miners Gala and the people that I've met in Durham have become quite a big part of my life, actually, in these past 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, we've kind of become friends over that time and over shared experiences that we've had at Durham. And it's absolutely brilliant for us as Socialist Think Tank to get a different perspective on socialism, because we've had people from all over the UK on, and a few people have asked us what people think of socialism in different countries of the world. And I suppose for us, we hear a lot about the Scandinavian model of socialism. It's seen as a more socialist area. Yet I'm not 100% sure that's always the case and how socialist Sweden actually is. So we're going to find out a little bit about that today. So I'm going to go into the question then. So we're going to come back to that kind of idea of the Swedish model of socialism a little bit later on, and a little bit about the research that you've been doing a little bit later. But I'm going to move on to the question I usually ask first, which is, what is socialism to you?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's important to state that socialism is not just an idea or an ideology, like, for example, liberalism or conservatism. So it's not an abstract utopian fantasy that someone has sort of drawn up in an ivory tower somewhere, or, in university. But socialism always begins with a movement. And I think that's what separates socialism from the other isms, for example, liberalism and conservatism. So socialism always begins with a movement under the conditions present at the time. And I would say, for me, if I should just sum it up in one word, that socialism is democracy. It's democracy. And I think it's democracy in all areas of society. And actually, the Swedish labor movement used to describe this by using a metaphor of 3 building blocks to describe socialism. So it's political democracy, social democracy, and economic democracy. And actually, I can show you a picture of this. So this is an election poster from 1948 in Sweden. And it says here, LO, so that's the equivalent of the TUC in Britain. So this is the unions. And these are the different building blocks. So you have the political and social democracy down here. And then sort of what was seen as being left to accomplish at the time was the economic democracy. So that's a big block coming on. And that's not really what happened, of course, but this is the vision. And I think this is, It has its limitations. Obviously, you could discuss like, maybe it was a bit naive to think that you could just, achieve political and social democracy, and then you just had to sort of put the big building block of economic democracy on top of it, and then you're finished. That wasn't really the case. So you can discuss what building block should come first, and what is more important, and so on. But I still think there's a point to this metaphor with the building blocks and these three sort of areas. So political democracy, of course, means that political power is equally shared, and not just on paper, but for real. So equal rights to exert influence on how society should be ruled or should be governed. For example, the right to vote, to take active part in decision making, freedom of speech, the right to organize, etc. And I would say we have this today to a certain extent, but clearly enormous improvements could be made. And I would say that's true both for Sweden and for the UK. So social democracy, not to be mixed up with the party, the Social Democrats, which is the Swedish Labour Party, but social democracy in this sense is that everyone is entitled to, for example, housing, healthcare, education, social security, and so on. And I would say in Sweden, we've had a bit more of that than in many other countries. But as I think we will get back to later on in the show, that has been rolled back to a great extent, because the power relations between labor and capital has shifted to capital's advance. And this sort of brings us to the third building block, which was the big building block in the picture, economic democracy, which I would say is the very opposite of what we have today. So I would say today, actually, what we have is economic dictatorship, where the decision-making power over things that deeply affect us all are in the hands of those who own the big companies, corporate managers, big shareholders, whereas the majority of us don't really own anything. Maybe we own our flats, but it's, mainly it's the bank who owns them anyway. So the same with our cars, for example. And we have to sell our labor power in order to survive. And what does that mean? I mean, that means that there is a minority getting rich from our labor, and then they give us back small handouts, a small amount of the value that we have actually produced ourselves, and they give it as wages. So economic democracy basically is shifting economic power to the people. And I think, that's my opinion, that this requires some kind of collective ownership of factories, infrastructure, natural resources, etc. So I think it would be about creating a system where we work for each other, so to speak. We work for the common good. And of course, this is not some kind of hippie fantasy. We would still need to work. We would still need to produce things. But the difference would be we would not produce them for profit, but we would produce actually what we need. So socialism is democracy in all areas of society. And I think also this presupposes equality in all areas of society for democracy to actually mean something. And I would say what democracy and equality gives us, what socialism basically would give us, is freedom. So freedom is not, I think, it's not achieved by everyone just doing exactly what they want all the time. But I would say, on the other hand, freedom is possible only when we make decisions together, when we take responsibility together. So no one is free until everyone is free, you say sometimes. And I think that when we actually shape society collectively, solidarity would also thrive. And that would enable real safety and real security. And I think the point is that under those conditions, and only under those conditions, we can truly be individuals. Like liberalism, they focus a lot on us being individuals. But I think in this society, it's not really possible to actually be individuals. But in a socialist society, we could be free to fully explore who we are, what we want to do, free to decide how we spend the majority of our time, which we are not today, actually, free from the fear of unemployment, the fear of being evicted, the fear of harassment, racism, sexism, systemic violence, police violence, for example, and free from the constant burden that is beauty standards telling us how to look. And I think for me, I would really like to be free to watch the news without feeling completely devastated or having to shut off my emotions just to be able to cope. So I think today those are sort of the choices that we have. So I would say the ultimate or the overarching goal of socialism is freedom. And I also think that these things like solidarity and care, working together towards a common goal, is actually in our nature. Like if anything is in our nature, I think these things are in our nature. And as probably you know, and many people watching know, Tony Benn argued in a brilliant speech called "The Issue is Thatcher," that, you know, solidarity is in the human nature. And he gives the example of the socialist train, that he's on a train and it breaks down, and what happens is people start to cooperate, you know, serving each other tea, very British, by the way, serving each other tea on the train, and sort of taking care of each other, getting to know each other. And when the train arrives, he says it's a socialist train. And I think this is like a good example. And he says, I mean, in his speech, he says that even though there is Thatcherism in Britain, people are still sort of socialists on that train, helping each other, looking out for each other. And I think today we could say that after, I mean, 40 years or so of neoliberal restructuring, constant propaganda telling us we are mainly consumers, we are customers, we are competitors, I still think you can see those kind of seeds of socialism everywhere if you look. So I think, for example, when people help each other out during the pandemic, when workers agree to not work for less than a certain wage, the collective agreement, or when people organize where they live against private landlords, or organize to stop the privatization of public assets such as hospitals or schools, or when people go on strike and suddenly they realize how much power they actually have as workers, and that things in the workplace could be very different indeed, and so on. So I think socialism is not an abstract idea, it's not a utopian dream. I think its promise is there in our collective practices and in our everyday lives, and it always begins with a movement. And I think it's also important to maybe say something about what socialism isn't when we talk about what is socialism. And I think it's important to state that socialism is not capitalism with a human face. There is no sustainable capitalism, there is no socially responsible capitalism, there is no feminist capitalism, there is no anti-racist capitalism, and so on. So we can make many changes within the frames of this system, achieve real improvements, but I think, as we have seen, they will never last in the long run, because our progress will always be attacked by the forces of capital, which is what is happening today in Europe and in other parts of the world, with the dismantling of the welfare states, the attacks on union rights, increasing inequality, and so on. So I think, therefore, it's not enough to redistribute resources within capitalism to mitigate the brutal effects of class society. I think socialism is about bursting the boundaries of this society and creating something that is actually very different. So that, of course, doesn't mean that we should just sit around on our asses, just, you know, waiting for something big to happen and doing nothing. That's not what I mean. Quite the opposite. I think within capitalist society, there can be more or less freedom through political reforms, through union struggles. We have actually made progress. The labor movement has made progress, and those victories have improved people's lives. And this is, of course, really important in itself. But perhaps even more crucial when we talk about socialism is that reformism and union struggles have also built the strength to take the next step for the working class, but also for the labor movement. So I think reforms or trade union victories can be stepping stones on the way to creating a socialist society. So this means that actually reformism can be revolutionary if carried out with the intention of radically increasing democracy. And the logic of reformism is that the more we move forward, the more we can move forward. And I think to quote Tony Benn for the second time, he said, "Hope is the fuel of progress." And I think that's really well put. That, you know, when we actually make progress, people will also believe that progress is possible, and they will demand actually, you know, more democracy, more equality. But sadly, the opposite is of course also true. So that when the labor movement doesn't really move, but stand still, people tend to become disillusioned and we lose ground.
That was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much. That was such a great description. To me, what you've described there is, it sounded to me like very much a bottom-up kind of socialism, a socialism that comes from the people, rather than, you know, the models that we've seen in the past of socialism, where it comes from the top down, where people are saying, this is going to be good for you. We will say how you live your lives. Would that be right, that you believe in a kind of a people's socialism where it comes from the bottom?
Yes, absolutely. And I think if you accept that socialism is democracy, you can't really have a top to bottom kind of system, because then, I mean, that's not democracy. So I absolutely agree. And I think that there has been a tendency also in the Swedish labor movement to sort of have a bit of this view that, you know, we know what's best for people, and we should, you know, sort of deliver the reforms. I really don't like this. I know this is an expression that you use in English as well, and we have it in Swedish, you know, the Swedish debate, you know, deliver this and deliver that. I really don't like that, because I think it's sort of, it means that it's something that is done to you or for you, and that I don't think in the long run, that's not like the sustainable way of doing things. So absolutely.
So for you, has this been something that you've always had socialist values? Have you grown up with socialist values, or is this something that you developed into?
I would say it's sort of a bit of both, because I mean, my grandparents were in the Swedish Labour Party. My grandmother was in the Labour Party, like on a local level, and my background is sort of political, in the sense that my parents used to talk about politics. It was a sort of a natural feature at the dinner table in our home, and talk about like the situation in the workplaces. And I remember when I was maybe 9 or something like that, 9 years old, I remember I asked my mother, like, what's the difference between the Social Democratic Party, the Labour Party, and the Conservative Party? And she drew a line, like, this is the left and this is right. And she said that the Labour Party, they represent the interests of ordinary people, and we're ordinary people. And the Conservative Party, they represent the interests of rich people, and we're not rich. So I think, I mean, basically that's all you need to know, you know. So I think for me, I've always had maybe socialist values and socialist principles, but I think it wasn't until I became myself actively involved in the labor movement that I sort of understood that this was socialism, and, you know, all the theoretical tools that you can use to sort of understand the world in a better way. I still remember when I was 13 or 14 and I was listening to my first lecture on Marxism. It was during it was a weekend of political education for the Labour Party youth organization. And I just remember still the feeling of realizing, for the first time, like how everything, like the big picture. And I think that was a real revelation for me that, you know, so this is connected to this, and this is connected to this, and this is the reason, you know, why society is unequal. So I think in one sense, it's always been there. But I think also that the kind of background that I have is that pretty much everyone was working class where I grew up. So there wasn't really, you know, locally those big differences. But what there was actually was sexism. So I think personally, my experience was more of being a girl and what that meant being a girl, and like how the boys always had the more power, and how, you know, this was unfair in different situations at school and outside of school. So I think that, and also realizing that racism was on the rise in Sweden in the 90s, because this was in the middle of the 90s, late 90s. Racism was really, you know, making ground in Sweden, and you could read in the papers about racist attacks and racist assaults. So I think feminism and anti-racism actually, and maybe also internationalism, international solidarity. I was very interested in Latin America, for example. I think many people in the left are. That those were maybe the things that made me want to do something. But when I was a part of the movement, I sort of, you know, maybe developed my socialist views a bit more.
What absolutely astounded me there is that you were talking about your first lecture on Marxism when you were so young, and there really isn't anything like that at the moment for young people. And more and more we're seeing people being educated in things in the negative. So we're seeing people watching YouTube videos about really American people shouting about how evil Marxism is. And no one seems to know what it is. And it's quite interesting that when people started saying that Jeremy Corbyn was a Marxist in this country, the young people of this country started to research what Marx is, and a greater and greater number of people started to identify as Marxists as a result. But the idea, so is that something that everyone receives, or is that a specific Labour Party kind of, I know the Swedish Labour Party thing? Is there a good political education system there?
I think it depends. I think in the you know, left-wing faction of the Labour Party, there used to be, I think, quite, you know, an impressive level of political education. I would say, especially actually in the youth organization, maybe particularly in the youth organization. So we had in the region where I live, Skåne, which is in the very south of Sweden, the Social Democratic Youth, the Labour Party youth organization, used to have a lot of political education, you know, study circles and lectures, and you would go away for the whole weekend. We had our own house, and people would come from all over the region and gather in this house and listen to lectures, and, you know, having workshops and watching political movies together, discussing, and also, you know, just, you know, playing around and, you know, having fun. Learning how to cook together, like how to cook for 30 people, something that I learned actually during those years. So I think at least during a specific period of time in the, you know, maybe in the 90s and in the, I think maybe also during a period of maybe 10, 15 years, this was something that in several regions actually of the Social Democratic Youth Organization, there was very sort of, the political education was very much alive. I think today, unfortunately, it's not really the case. And I think it's been a long time since that was the case in the party. I think you would have to go back to maybe the 70s to find something similar in the party actually. So, but I'm very happy actually that I became an activist during those years, because that has shaped me. And I think, you know, Bruce Springsteen, he sings in the song No Surrender that he learned more from a 3-minute record than he ever learned in school. And I think for me, I really learned more from those weekend courses and those lectures and study circles than I learned in school. or at university, I would say. So I think political education is, I think it's really, really crucial. And I think when we don't have political education, that's when we lose. I really do think that.
I would very much agree with that sentiment, and I think it's something that we need to improve a lot, and it's something that we're involved in increasingly in Socialist Think Tank at the moment, and that's really probably why we exist, to try to give people this idea that, you know, we aren't Reds under the bed, we aren't these top-down authoritarians who are socialists. You know, the socialism is something different to that for us, for the vast majority of socialists, actually. So I'm going to move on to a little bit about the differences between Sweden and the UK. So what's your perception of the differences between the politics of Sweden and the politics of the UK? And also, do you feel like, how socialist do you feel that Sweden is?
On a scale from 1 to 10, or?
We're going to do, I'm a very quantitative person. I will put things into numbers given the chance, so don't do that. Just tell me your experiences and we'll go qualitative with this one.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that maybe one of the main differences is that in Sweden, the labor movement, social democracy, was in power for a very long time. So from the 30s until the late 70s, there was, 44 years of Labour government. And I think what that meant was that people, sort of everyone, had to adjust to that. Sort of every discussion had as a starting point that, you know, the welfare state was a good thing. We should have some kind of rights in the workplace. And even the Liberal Party, or the small liberal parties, they sort of had to adjust to this. So they were some kind of social liberals, and they're not anymore. But I think that sort of notion of the Labour Party as always being in power. What is power? It's the Labour Party. I think that has shaped Sweden's political history a lot. And then what happened was that in 2006, we got a conservative government. You could say that maybe from the late 70s and up until then, it had shifted sort of back and forth. So you could have a Labour government and then you can have a conservative government. But what happened was in 2006, we had a conservative government who was really, really set on fundamentally changing Swedish society, doing all the things that previous conservative governments hadn't dared doing, because there was still sort of a social democratic hegemony in Sweden. But then there wasn't any more, and they won in 2006, and they won again in 2010. And that, I think, was the longest time that there had been a conservative government, and they changed a lot of things. So now, maybe you don't really notice a lot of that 44-year-long Labour, government period. But I think it has sort of shaped the self-image of the Swedish Labour movement, that, we're really supposed to be in power. And I think a lot of people haven't really got still why isn't the Labour Party? I mean, now we have a minority government, which is led by the Social Democrats, but they can't really do anything. So it's been very long since we had any big reforms, like democracy, equality reforms in Sweden. But I think maybe that's a difference, that, the long history of Labour governments and what that has done to the self-image of the Labour movement. And I don't think that's the same in the UK. I think another difference is the electoral system, where you have this first past the post system, and we have another system. So in Sweden, it's like, the votes for the smaller parties, they also count. So no vote is really wasted in that sense. But what it means is also that there isn't maybe that sort of clear division between left and right. So in Sweden, it's a lot about coalition building, you know, the handshake between labor and capital, sort of, you know, compromising. It's like this is not just a means, but it's like a goal in itself. And I, of course, as you would understand, I don't really agree with that way of doing things, but I think there is a difference in sort of, and that affects also how the political debate, of course, shapes. And I think I like watching the debates from the UK, from the Parliament, because they're much more, you know, engaging, and people seem to be actually angry, and, you know, sort of really giving really good and engaging speeches. And I think in the Swedish Parliament, it's a bit more of a snooze fest. I have some friends in Parliament, so I mean, of course, I don't mean them, but I think in general, it's more like, you know, like we should always compromise, and it's for the greater good, and like in the end everyone has the same interest. But I mean, of course, that's not the case. So in reality, there's always someone who's winning and someone who's losing. But and also I think like a third difference that I could mention is that in the British Labour Party, you talk a lot about left and right, like the factions, and you have like official organizations who are sort of officially left-wing, and in the Swedish Social Democratic Party, it's much more like there is no right or left. We're all friends in here. We shouldn't talk about each other like that. And of course, in reality, there are exactly the same ideological differences as you have in the Labour Party. So it's exactly the same. It's just that we're not sort of allowed to talk about it or sort of organize in that way, in that factional way. So that's also a big difference, I would say.
Everything you said there is really interesting. So the system of government sort of has led towards more compromise. We feel at the moment, well, I certainly feel at the moment that the Labour Party are compromising before they go to the electorate, kind of thing. So that's the start point, is to go for a compromise position to see if you can get elected, and then you compromise more when you're in government. But that seems to be what's happening at the moment. But you talked about the factions within the Labour Party. There's a little joke around. There's a group now that's called Labour to Win, and a lot of people are calling them the group formerly known as Labour to Lose. So under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, they seemed absolutely desperate to do everything they could possibly do to make sure Labour didn't win. But now they're called Labour to Win because they're now in charge of the agenda. So that's really, really interesting, all those ideas. So you've got a form of proportional representation. Is that what you would call it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how does that work? Is that on a system of a certain percentage of votes receive a certain number of MPs? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly how it is, and it's the same on the local level and the regional level. So it's the same system on all the three levels of government. So it's a proportional representation, and I think also what we have is what I think you would call within the parties open selection. So we always choose our MPs locally. So it's not like someone can, you know, just be sat on their post forever and ever. I mean, of course, in reality, it could be that way because, I mean, it depends, but at least formally, this is always decided ahead of each election who's going to be the candidate, or the candidates, because there can be several. If it's like a larger city, there can be quite many MPs. So that's also, I think, a difference, and that maybe our local MPs aren't that. I get the impression that in Britain that the local MPs are quite well known locally. Sort of as individuals, quite sort of well known, and they have their office, if I've understood it correctly, and people can come and sort of have, you know, complaints and ask for help with things. And that's not really how it is in Sweden. So you could be quite anonymous actually as an MP locally. So I think that's also a bit of a difference. But I think we think it's absolutely absurd like your system with the MPs, that you don't really choose your own who's going to represent you in Parliament. And also that sort of the parliamentary Labour Party is like its own party, if I've understood it correctly, and that's not how it is in Sweden.
Yeah, we get so in theory, members get to choose who their MP is. Or, well, we get to choose everything. So if you're a parish councillor, which would be the smallest level of government, or a county councillor, you would face open selection naturally. But an MP, you have to do something called a trigger ballot.
Yeah.
Within the Labour Party. This is only within the Labour Party. The Conservatives just have someone at head office choose who is going to run in.
Really?
That's the way the Conservatives do it.
That's even worse. That's even worse, actually.
Yeah, well, that's I don't know. I've never been in the Conservative Party, and I don't know what they do. But that appears to be what it is. And Boris Johnson actually removed the right of a lot of people who wouldn't go along with his Brexit deal.
Yeah, that's right.
He removed their right to stand at all at the next election when he called the election. So that's how they maintain discipline. But in the Labour Party, you would need a trigger ballot, which means you have to say, actually, we want the opportunity to vote you out, which is actually it's a really unfair thing to do, because some people might just want democracy and they might be going to vote for the MP, but the MP thinks, well, actually, I've been triggered here. You've forced me to face an election I didn't want to face. So it's an unfair. I'd rather go for open selection. It definitely should have been the case, but sadly not. Sadly, that isn't what happens. So what do you think went wrong in Sweden? So you said you had that long period of government for the Labour Party. So why do you think people's opinions started to change and they looked more towards a Conservative government?
Well, first of all, I don't really think people's opinions changed that much. I think actually politics changed more than, because they make these surveys, about people's opinions on the welfare state and, how prone they are to pay taxes, and like, would you be prepared to pay more tax if it, went to hospitals, etc., those kind of questions. And actually what those surveys show is that people's opinions haven't really changed that much. So there's still quite a large actually support for a strong welfare state, a big public sector, etc. But I think what actually happened was that I think because of the economic crisis in big parts of the world in the 70s, it was sort of harder for the Social Democratic Party in Sweden to maintain this compromise between labor and capital, because that compromise built on both sides getting something out of that compromise. So we could have higher wages, we could have, welfare reforms, but they could also have their profits. And what happened, maybe in the late 70s, early 80s, was that this wasn't the case anymore. So something had to give. And what actually happened was that capital made really big advances, and this had, I think, an ideological effect on the Social Democratic Party and the entire labor movement, actually. So I think we had sort of our own new labor era in, maybe not as extreme, but still, I think there was a lot of actually Swedish social democratic politicians going to Britain and being inspired. And actually what's interesting, also conservative politicians, like I told you before about the conservative government from 2006 to 2014, they were very inspired by actually New Labour and sort of how to take a word and give it another meaning. And, they talked a lot about, they were the working party, not the Workers' Party, but the working party. And, they were the party for ordinary people. And instead of talking about class society, they talked about people being outside. So we have to sort of, get people on inside. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by giving them jobs with very low wages, for example. So I think there are a lot of actually similarities, I think, but I think Sweden has been a bit more slow in this kind of political development. So I think what happened was some, you know, like objective actually conditions changing, it was harder to maintain this compromise between labor and capital where both sides could have something. But there was also an ideological shift towards a sort of more new labor view on social democracy. And that hasn't changed back. I mean, we're still actually stuck with pretty much with that kind of social democratic party. So it's more about, you know, making small adjustments within this system. There hasn't really been, like I said before, any big reforms in maybe 20 years or so. So there is, you can also see how the Swedish society has changed up until, I think, from the 1930s and up until the 1980s. There was just increasing equality. If you look at income, like the income gap was just smaller and smaller. And I think the sort of equality, peak equality was 1980. And then it has just, you know, gone downhill from there. So now Sweden is actually one of the countries where inequality is increasing, you know, most rapidly. So it's like completely the other way around now. And from, you know, the very strong welfare state with a big public sector, we've had a lot of cutbacks. It always starts with cutbacks, I think, you know, austerity, and then privatizations. Because why not privatize something if it's already run down and, you know, people are not very happy, so then you can privatize it. So there has been, I mean, like an enormous shift in Sweden when it comes to who runs the schools, who runs the hospitals, not the hospitals as much, but more like the local healthcare centers. And also, you know, care. So it's, I think it's, I wish I could say that it's a socialist paradise, but I think, unfortunately, it has changed a lot. And I think that maybe like how people outside of Sweden perceive Sweden is, I think, a bit lagging behind. So people still think it's like it was in the 1980s or the 1990s, but it really isn't, unfortunately.
The dates that you mentioned there, so you mentioned 1980 was perhaps peak equality. I just wondered there whether, obviously, that was kind of the Thatcher Reagan era. Do you think that was influential in the kind of worldview?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was influential. I think there was sort of the criticism of the welfare state being bureaucratic and, you know, sort of like not respecting individuality. And I think that definitely, you know, there were definitely influences from both Thatcher and Reagan, like now people want to choose. That's been sort of a slogan, like nowadays people want to choose, they want freedom of choice. So freedom of choice is sort of almost like a religion, I think, a political religion in Sweden today. So it's about, you know, choosing school, choosing your doctor, choosing, you know, elderly care, who's going to provide. So it's, there's a lot of talk about freedom of choice, but what it really means is like freedom for companies to establish themselves within the welfare sector. And they make a lot of money because they sort of get the same funding as the public institutions, but they make a profit because they cut back on staff, for example, and also like equipment and things. So they make a profit, and these are, I mean, usually these are very big companies, so they exist perhaps all over Europe. So it's not like the small company, you know, local company or anything like that. It's like big companies, and they make billions actually every year, sort of from the taxpayers' money, actually, because that's how they start out, and that's sort of the conditions for them to actually to run. So I think it's there's sort of like disillusioned view in the labor movement today that people want freedom of choice, and we can't take it away from them now that they have got freedom of choice. But I think actually what people want is like they want schools that work, they want hospitals that work, they want, healthcare centers that work, they want elderly care that's good. So I don't think the freedom of choice really is that important to people, but I think there is it's like something that you can't really challenge today, because everyone has signed up on this freedom of choice kind of thing. So that affects everything, like the whole political climate.
I think if we go back to what you were saying at the beginning about socialism being freedom, actually it's not really freedom of choice, is it? It's you've been forced into a certain way of life through capitalism, and I think it's the illusion of choice.
Yeah, actually in some municipalities, for example, the municipality where I grew up, elderly people can't choose public elderly care anymore because there isn't any. So they can just choose between, like one big private company and maybe another private big company. So that's what happens. And we also have municipalities here in the south of Sweden where there isn't any council housing because they've sold it all off. So there's only private landlords. And then there's a real housing crisis in Sweden, actually. People don't have anywhere to live, especially young people, working class people, people who've come as refugees during the past 5 or 6 years. There's really, people can't afford to live, like have their own flat. And it's harder, of course, to do something about that when there's no council housing. So actually that choice is, of course, a choice for the companies. It's not a choice for people. But I think, like on an ideological level, there is sort of a hegemony today in Sweden that it is freedom of choice and you can't take that away from people. So I think that really affects. And also, this is not just ideological, because this is also in the law. Like we have a law about, actually it's called the law of freedom of choice within the healthcare system, meaning that, private entrepreneurs can, start healthcare centers, for example. They have to be approved by the regional authorities, but they can do, pretty much what they want. So that's the one side of it. And the other side of it is freedom of choice for, the patient, the individual to choose where to go. But it's actually, so there's a law about freedom of choice, which means that it's quite hard to I think it's always like that, like I said before, that if we move forward, we can move forward even more. But if we stand still, or if we things start to be rolled back, it's very, very tough. So it's like, if you let go, and I think that has been very much the logic of the Swedish Social Democratic Party, that this is just a small compromise. This is just, we have to do this now, but and then it turns out in reality, it's extremely hard to actually take back what has been lost. It's very hard to take back what has been privatized. It's a much bigger thing. It's much harder than to actually keep it public in the first place. So I think there has been really a very naive view that, we can accept this privatization now and then we'll see, but it's not like that. It's not we'll see, because what happens is just more and more companies come in to the welfare sector. So actually, I think the number of people who work in private welfare in Sweden is 4 times as many now as it was in 1980. So that's just an example of this very fundamental change, and it's very hard to roll back once that
I'm going to come on now to your thesis, because I think this is all linked in. So if you can tell us all a little bit about your thesis, what it's about, and also, again, I'm noticing a year thing here. You mentioned the Conservatives were elected in 2006. So if you can give us a little bit of context around, what maybe happened in that election, and do you think your thesis research is linked to that particular result of an election outcome, or is that, you might not have considered that before, or so tell us a little bit about your thesis.
I can actually show it to you. It looks like this. It's red, of course. It's called, translated to English, it's called The Struggle Over the Value of Welfare Work, Welfare Labor. And it's about a strike that took place in 2003. So that was a couple of years before this sort of shift in politics. And this was a very big strike. It lasted for 5 weeks. And I think 600,000 work days were lost. So that's a really big strike, maybe the biggest labor conflict in the public sector in Sweden ever, I think. And this union, the Municipal Workers Union, consists mainly of women and a lot of also racialized members. And these are people who are cleaners, who work in the school kitchens, who are, I think it's called auxiliary nurses, and who work in childcare facilities and so on. Also, you know, working with the cleaning streets and working in parks and things like that. So it's a really big union, and they have a lot of different actually groups that they organize. So this strike was really sort of a welfare strike. So they went on strike for higher wages. That was the sort of the formal demand, but it was also a lot about the welfare sector having for a long time being, you know, not prioritized politically, and there was a lack of resources. And the big crisis in the 90s with, you know, which was like a financial crisis, and there were a lot of cutbacks in the welfare sector. So they really, you know, bore the burden of that crisis. And for the municipal workers, this crisis was very much ongoing still in 2003, actually, because they hadn't really, well, you could say they were still lagging behind when it comes to wages. And so they had a tough situation, and they were actually very angry, and they went on this huge strike. And they sort of, you could see them everywhere in Sweden with this on the book. There's the red jacket, there's a strike jacket, and it says, the slogan was, if you translate it, like, we take the fight, or something like that. And since in a lot of municipalities and regions, social democratic politicians were actually the employers of the municipal workers, this was also a big, you know, there were really big tensions within the labor movement, where the municipal workers who were on strike thought the Social Democratic Party and the Social Democratic politicians should be, you know, show solidarity with the striking workers because we belong to the same movement. But the politicians, they saw themselves as employers and acted as employers, and you know, also acted quite strongly. I mean, they really did things to weaken the strike, the effects of the strike. So they were really, you know, and no one had ever written anything, you know, long about this strike. So what I did was I interviewed people who were organizing the strike and who were on strike themselves, mainly on the local level, and asking them about their experiences and their memories, recollections of this strike. And what it turned out that even though you couldn't call this strike a victory in the sense that they achieved, you know, they didn't really get the pay rise that they demanded. And in many ways, it was seen as a failure. The strike was sort of described in the media as a failure. But what I find very interesting, and this is a lot about in the book is about this, is that what they discovered was that they had a lot of power, you know, as workers, and they started to see themselves in a different way. They started to see the union in a different way. They sort of discovered new ways of being you know, union member, more sort of activist ways of, you know, union activity. So actually something was won as well in this strike, something that's not about maybe, you know, numbers, but something else. And in the book, I refer to this as cultures of solidarity, which is there's an American researcher called Rick Fantasia, who's written a book called Cultures of Solidarity, and it's mainly about wildcat strikes in the US in the 70s and 80s. And he explores, these processes of solidarity between striking workers and how people's, view of the world changed because they were in the strike. I find it very interesting that although this strike was not wildcat, I mean, this was a national union, established union, quite close to the Social Democratic Party. They had this strike, but still all those processes of solidarity and, collective strength and sort of changing your views of the world and how the union should work and, the union should be more democratic. All those things were there, even though this wasn't actually a strike where the workers decided for themselves, because they didn't decide when the strike was over. The leadership of the union decided when the strike was over. And a lot of people wanted to continue to be on strike, but they couldn't because that's not how it works. So yeah, so that's a little bit about my thesis. And I think in connection to the political development in Sweden, you could say that this strike maybe was an expression of also like the Social Democratic Party or the labor movement hadn't really prioritized the welfare sector in many years and didn't really see that as important. It was more seen like a cost, so like a problem and not an asset. And what they said were like, we keep the society going, we keep Sweden going, and if we don't work, nothing will work. So, and they also said that we do this not just for us, but also for the patients and for the pupils, and wanted to sort of make it into a discussion about the welfare sector and funding, etc. And the employers, of course, they didn't want it to be a discussion about that. They just said that we can't afford it, we can't afford pay rises, and that was that. So.
Thank you so much for that. That was really, really thoroughly interesting. And I think what you've described there is sort of what's happened in quite a few places within the labour movement. The labour movement might have forgotten who it is and who it represents and what it's for, and it's just become a party of government rather than a party of the people, which allows that right-wing narrative of we are for the people to slip in. So I want to kind of move on now just to the very last section. We always like to end on an upbeat note. So what would your hopes for the future be with socialism? Is there any way you think we can achieve socialism? And are there any kind of lessons maybe? So that's quite an open question. So is there anything positive and hopeful in socialism that you see at the moment? Because you definitely hinted at a positivity in that solidarity that those workers showed one another, and when they realized that they were the union, the national union might make decisions, but actually the important people in a union are the people.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there is a lot of hope in like all those kinds of collective action. And actually, if you look at it like in a global perspective, there has actually been an upsurge in labor conflicts and strikes in the past couple of years. There's been massive strikes in India, for example, massive strikes in Chile. There's been like teacher strikes in the US. And what's interesting is that it's, often it's service workers, it's welfare workers, and it's like female dominated groups who go on strike. So I think, and what they tend to do, like the people I interviewed for my thesis, they tend to frame their demands as being, for the public good. So this, the demands are good for everyone because it means like a better public sector, better schools, better education, better healthcare, etc. And I think in that there is a potential for solidarity, like a bigger solidarity, not just solidarity between the striking workers, but also between the public and the workers on strike. And I think that's like maybe one of the most hopeful things. I know in the UK that there has also been a couple of strikes like this, and also like rallies, and where people have come together to sort of, I know there's been like the junior doctors and teachers assistants, and so I think there's potential in that sort of enhanced solidarity, that, you know, widened solidarity, and sort of making those kind of strikes more political, because it is political, because it's got to do with things that sort of affect not just the people who work there, but also people who are dependent on the welfare sector. So that's, I think, is something hopeful. I would have said, maybe I would still say, that the development of the British Labour Party has given me a lot of hope, at least up until a couple of months ago. Actually, I think that's why also we wanted to go to Durham for the Miners' Gala, because we felt quite starved when it came to political hope, because the Swedish Labour Party has been in stagnation for so many years now. And I think it's become worse, actually. It's not really like in maybe 15 or 20 years ago, there was still quite a lot of debates, and people, like even ministers in government, could sort of represent some kind of left-wing views within the party. But today it's just like, oh, we're all in the same boat and don't rock the boat. It's very much don't rock the boat. Now we just, you know, put the lid on everything, and, you know, the party line is all that matters. And I think it's really draining intellectually, because you can't really think, you can't discuss, you can't, you know, there's not much political education. So I think for us, it was just a fantastic experience when Jeremy Corbyn was elected. We started actually following that campaign, and, you know, oh, there's someone called Jeremy Corbyn, and he's left wing and he's a candidate. And we actually watched live when he won. And we watched live when he won the second time after the chicken coup. And we watched also some rallies, and just felt like, and then after the election in 2017, where Labour got almost 40%, which is decided like on a whim, very spontaneously. We never do anything spontaneously, because you can't really do that if you haven't got money, which we don't. But then we decided we have to go to Durham to this Miners' Gala, because we had seen that Jeremy Corbyn was going to speak at the Miners' Gala, and we just felt we have to watch this man speak, because he's like, so he gives us so much hope. And then we went and we discovered that it wasn't, of course, just Jeremy Corbyn. There were lots of brilliant speakers, and, you know, lots of really brilliant people, really smart people who we got to meet. So that has actually, for us in the past 5 years, given us, and not just me and my partner, but I have a lot of comrades and friends in Sweden who feel the same way, who have sort of been looking towards the UK for political hope and for inspiration. And we have felt very sort of drawn towards this more sort of pluralistic, maybe you could say, Labour movement, and maybe more activist in a way. So then, of course, now things are looking a bit, you know, bad with the new leadership and sort of the purge of left-wing members, which we think, of course, is really appalling. And we have also realized that maybe we had a bit of a romanticized view of the Corbyn movement. We realized now that maybe there was a lack in political education, maybe there was, you know, lack in community organizing, building coalitions on the ground, etc., etc. But still, I think there was something that made not only like thousands and thousands of people in the UK show up for rallies, but we were also sitting, I mean, in a flat in the south of Sweden, watching these rallies, feeling like this is about us as well. So I think for me, international solidarity and sort of making connections internationally is something that personally for me, that gives me a lot of hope, and has really sort of kept me above the surface in this past 5 years. And I think it's a very nice, I mean, it's a tradition that we should be proud of as well, like internationalism and international solidarity. Like in Sweden there has been up until maybe, at least up until the 80s, a tradition of sort of taking a stand for oppressed peoples in other countries, in Latin America, in Africa, like in the apartheid regime in South Africa. And we had a prime minister called Olof Palme who was murdered in the 1980s. And he was really a lot about international solidarity. He was a friend of Nelson Mandela. He was a friend of Fidel Castro, for example. So I think that tradition is something that sort of we have to build upon, and that really gives me hope. And I think also that's one way of countering the sort of more nationalist view of sort of like, we have to protect the welfare state by not letting any refugees in. And there's been in Sweden also unfortunately, a very big shift when it comes to that. So I think talking about international solidarity and like we have the same interests in the UK, the workers in the UK and the workers in Sweden, or the workers in Latin America, I think that's also a way of sort of changing that debate and showing that actually we have a lot in common, and we need to stand together.
That is a really wonderful, hopeful message, and I really enjoyed listening to that. It reminded me of all the hope that we had at that time, but also we've got quite a lot of things going on as well. So those people who were brought together by the Corbyn movement are going into doing things, and there are a few really exciting projects going on. So, and you never know, maybe we can do a bit of international solidarity. Perhaps we'll have a Swedish socialist think tank at some point. Perhaps we could all link up together. I'd like to really thank you on behalf of Socialist Think Tank. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you, and I'm sure that everyone will thoroughly enjoy that, and will reciprocate the feeling of hope that we will share in the future, I hope. And I hope to see you at the gala as well next time, if we're ever allowed to go back outside again. So that'll be lovely. So thank you again, and we will definitely be in touch.
Yeah, thank you. And just before I leave, I just want to show you, speaking of international solidarity, that I have got my Orgreave Truth and Justice Campaign t-shirt on. It hasn't really, you haven't noticed, but it's there.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure they will appreciate that as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. Solidarity.
Keep the red flag flying there.